The incidents of domestic violence in the United States are staggering. And when you look at the statistics on domestic violence in African American women, it's even more shocking. With me on Truthout Interviews are three contributors to a three-part series that ran on Truthout. Tasahsa Henderson, Monica Trinidad, and Ash Stephens all contributed to this series that examined the case of Marissa Alexander and domestic violence. This is a three-part series that explores the intersections of domestic violence, race, and the criminal justice system. First up is Tasahsa Henderson from the Chicago Alliance to Free Marissa Alexander. Tasahsa Henderson's article on Truthout is entitled "For Black Women, Domestic Violence and State Violence Go Hand in Hand." Hello, Tasahsa. Welcome to Truthout Interviews.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You know, for those who don't know Marissa Alexander's case, can you give the viewers a summary of her arrest, or at least the events that led to her arrest and eventual imprisonment? She has a trial coming up in December, and perhaps you can talk on that. But people might not know what the events were that led to her arrest.
Well, in 2010, when Marissa was returning to the home that she shared with her estranged husband, Rico Gray, he threatened her and attacked her. So she had fired a warning shot, to the wall.
Oh, she had a handgun then?
Yeah, a handgun. Yeah, license registered handgun, and charged with aggravated assault. And she faced 20 years. And in 2012, she was convicted of aggravated assault. But in 2013, the sentence was overturned because of improper jury instructions. So now she's facing a retrial on starting December 8th of this year. But now she's facing 60 years instead of 20 because of Florida's mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines, which states she has to serve 3 20-year sentences consecutively.
Is she currently imprisoned, or is she out on bail or bond?
She's out on bond. She was out on bond November 2013.
Okay, so she's awaiting this upcoming trial because of minimum sentencing. And let's go into what the minimum sentencing laws are.
I think those laws were first enacted, maybe starting in the 90s. And there was a rash of new laws with stiffer penalties, and mandatory minimums were one of those laws. And it has greatly affected not only Marissa, but a lot of other women, a lot of other people who were sentenced to very long prison sentences for oftentimes minor nonviolent crimes because of these mandatory minimums.
Was Marissa involved in some kind of was she prosecuted for another violation of law and something else?
No.
Oh, okay. So from what I understand then, from at least with your article, is that these minimum sentencing laws have to do with the fact that oftentimes in an abusive relationship or in a case of domestic violence, that oftentimes the spouse, often and more often than not, it's a woman, is asked to do illegal things for their significant other or their spouse, and so they are involved at some level in criminal activity. With regards to Marissa Alexander, how does minimum sentencing come into play in this?
Marissa wasn't involved in any illegal activities or anything. I guess Florida's particular mandatory minimum sentencing law. I think specifically, for the charge of assault. That kind of brings that mandatory minimum into it.
So can you talk a little bit about domestic violence and how criminalization essentially intersect? Because that's the thrust of your article.
Women who are victims of domestic violence, like we mentioned previously, they may be coerced into involvement in criminalized activity, or they are arrested for defending themselves against their abusive partner, and even sometimes arrested for failing to for exposing their children to the abuse. Also, that's something that women are arrested for also. And a very large majority of women in jail and prisons have histories of experiencing, domestic violence.
Well, Tasahsa, I want to thank you for being on Truthout Interviews.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Next up are Monica Trinidad and Ash Stephens, both of whom contributed to the series on domestic violence. Monica's op-ed is entitled Personalizing Our Resistance to Domestic Violence, and Ash's analysis is social media, and Marissa Alexander, freedom, mobilization, and victim blaming. Monica, Ash, welcome to Truthout Interviews.
Hi, yes.
Hi, how are you?
So, Monica, my first question is directed at you. Your article is about your own experience with domestic violence. It's also about why your ordeal and other narratives about domestic violence are key in keeping them alive, and it's important to keep them alive in the social narrative. And can you talk a little bit about your own personal story that you highlight in the Truthout piece and the op-ed piece that you wrote, and also about how this is integral to movement building?
Sure. So I think I wrote the piece kind of as a way to break the silence around a lot of survivor stories, but also to interrupt the narrative around victim blaming. I know Ash touched on that a little bit in their piece. And so it's not our job as survivors to convince people that it's not our fault, but it's also important to share our stories in order to create this sort of narrative around the fact that domestic violence happens on a large scale to Black and brown folks, but not only are they experiencing interpersonal violence, but they're also experiencing state violence.
With your own personal story, I think one of the things that I took away from it was when you compare it to, for example, what Marissa Alexander went through and what she's going through now, there is a range of what you classify as domestic violence. It's not just one thing. I mean, you were in a relationship where your significant other, for lack of a better term, was cruel in sort of subtle ways and then in a violent way.
The way we perceive domestic violence is in a very physical way. And I think that by talking about my experience with it, I wanted to kind of interrupt that definition, I guess, by showing folks that it's not just physical, that it's also emotional, mental, verbal, and comes in so many different forms that a lot of us, even in our organizing circles, wouldn't sometimes even recognize if domestic violence was occurring.
Ash, I want to turn to you because Monica talks a little bit about movement building, and in your piece on Truthout, you talk about the use of social media. You particularly highlight Twitter, and your piece is about both the positive aspects of social networking, or at least social media, and the way in which sometimes it's not so positive.
Yeah, so I think that involving Marissa's case, the Free Marissa campaign, and also the Chicago Alliance to Free Marissa Alexander and other organizations, right? We've been using social media, not just Twitter, but also Facebook and Tumblr, as large mobilization tools, right? To get out information about her case, because larger media outlets aren't doing so. Like, they're not talking about Marissa's case. They're not talking about, the fact that her trial is coming up December 8th. They're not doing that work. And so a lot of these other outlets are doing that. And so I think that's a very positive thing that we've seen, and also very positive for her fundraising for her legal defense. But yes, there is this other aspect of folks just doing this thing that I do call explaining away, and other journalists have coined that term too, talking about just thinking about the specific violence that she's experienced, but then kind of negating that violence by saying, well, why was she there in the first place? Why was she involved with this person, et cetera, et cetera. Those things should not be the topic of conversation, right? The topics that we should be talking about and the conversations we should be having are exactly what a lot of what Monica's story was discussing, and a lot of the other conversations that we're having on social media of the fact that this violence does happen, in all types of forms. And those are our problems. Those are our issues. Not why would someone marry someone or why would someone have a child with someone. All of that is totally irrelevant. And so I think that like using Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, and all these things to mobilize people and to get out information about her case is great. And we've been doing that. We're going to continue to do that work. But then the flip side, that I talk about, like this like victim blaming stuff, it's going on outside of social media. And so I think social media is just another platform for people to continue to do that. And part of what I think our like mobilization efforts are doing are also trying to interrupt that conversation.
There's a term called Monday morning quarterbacking where people sit around and they talk about the football game that occurred. What I see with regards to Marissa Alexander is a lot of Monday morning lawyering, people feeling like they are experts in the law, in the legal field, and explain away what transpired between her and her husband through technical language in the law, like, oh, well, it doesn't, stand your ground doesn't count because she did X, Y, and Z. I see that a lot in the comment sections.
Specifically about the stand your ground, right? There was in June, there was or over the summer, there was a retraction to stand your ground, right? And Marissa's case was largely a part of that kind of retraction. And so it's kind of really amazing and difficult to see that she's a part of this like process of people in Florida recognizing that that law is totally unjust and, is not at all helping victims, survivors of domestic violence, but in turn criminalizing them. And then they're using this case that's going on with Marissa to point out the fact that Stand Your Ground has some issues, but they're not allowing her to use that in court. And so, people are using kind of the stand your ground, like these ideas about mandatory minimums, right? So the reason why Marissa was given 20 years and trying to explain all of this like legal jargon when this is a whole like series of like other type of conversations like to be had. Like we know that the law as it states and then the application are like can be two totally different things, especially in this case. But I think that is something that people are doing that also is a part of this like explaining away thing. Like her abuser has admitted to this abuse. So also why would that not be enough, right? Like at what point is it going to be enough to say that like this happened, her response, it was totally justified, right? No one was harmed. And like, that's enough.
And that's why I think that Ash's piece is really important because we cannot depend on mainstream media to cover the accuracy, to cover Marissa's story at all. And so I think that creating new innovative ways through social media platforms is incredibly important in getting this case out there because like Ash was just saying, people are using all of this large jargon around the mandatory minimums. And it's like, no, this is a real person experiencing real violence. This is like, I used to be a rape crisis counselor and we would refer to the survivors going through the hospital experience and the court experience as almost like the second abuse, the second rape. And I feel like that's something important to notice is that this is Marissa going through that second abuse by the state now. And so I feel like it's so important to keep the legality around the case in the picture, but also to keep the personal in the picture as well. And that's what I was trying to do with my piece.
Since you wrote the articles on Truthout, what has been the reaction with regards to not only the case with Marissa Alexander, but just domestic abuse in general?
A lot of the feedback that I got from my article was pretty positive. I got a lot of private messages on Twitter from folks that had shared it, just talking about how they were really excited that I was bringing about the importance of personal narrative when talking about domestic violence. And then also just bringing the conversation back to the fact that just because we're organizing in radical grassroots organizing doesn't mean that we're immune to any sort of domestic violence and that this could happen to anyone. So.
And Ash, what about you? What's been the reaction to your article?
Like personally, I've been having like a lot of conversations with folks that maybe weren't necessarily realizing that they were doing the thing that I was writing about, right? And so not just for like Marissa, but for like other survivors that we're seeing, because I think we're kind of in this like climate of like domestic violence like going on like multiple levels. And so I've been having those conversations with folks that like there's a name for what you're doing. It's called victim blaming, and this is why you shouldn't do that. And then also I think that largely, I think part of my piece too was just kind of like an added thing to like the work that we've all been doing from Marissa, and kind of like saying this is a way that folks can also get involved, is through like the positive ways of using social media. And because we use that a lot, like there's a campaign we've been working on all of October. And so people have been like either adding me on certain things or like friending the Free Marissa page and such, and trying to use that way to, again, like try to disrupt like a lot of what they're seeing, which I think has been very positive too.
All righty. Well, Monica, Ash, I want to thank you very much for being on Truthout Interviews.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I want to thank all three of my guests, Tasahsa Henderson, Monica Trinidad, and Ash Stephens, all of whom contributed to the series on Truthout that explored the intersections of domestic violence, race, and the criminal justice system, with special emphasis on the case of Marissa Alexander. Thanks for watching Truthout Interviews. I'm Ted Asregadoo, and we'll see you next time.